Okay, my name's Vanessa Liell. Welcome today. I'm the Executive Director of Commtract. For those of you that don't know us, we're a digital platform that connects marketing and communications specialists to part-time and freelance work. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend the respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today as well. We're very lucky to have Dalidakis joining us today. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Most recently, Phil was the Executive General Manager, Corporate Services Australia Post, where he supported the business engaging with people, customers, community and government. Before joining, Philip served as Victoria's Minister for Innovation and Digital Economy, Trade and Investment and Small Business. He also has worked as a staffer in federal government for Minister Conroy prior to that. So today's session is really around what life is like in political office, and probably very timely this week, but more importantly for our network, what skills and capabilities are critical when you're running a political office, and also what the career opportunities are. So I might kick off, Phil, just with a little bit of an overview of your experience and what you looked for.
Yeah, sure. So I guess my career is in sort of two halves. The first career was in finance, where I started my career at Deloitte. From Deloitte, went to a small family group of companies as their financial controller, then ended up at Centro Property Group working in their property finance team. At this point, I always make it clear I joined Centro when their share price was $3.30, and I left when their share price was $7.70, and I take no responsibility for it going up to $10 or down to 4 cents. I then jumped into government and worked when Steve Bracks was Premier as the Senior Energy Advisor. From there, left, became the CEO of a major industry association here in Victoria, did that for nearly 3.5 years, then joined Senator Conroy as his Deputy Chief of Staff at a pretty exciting time with the rollout of the NBN, digital switchover, a range of other initiatives as well. Obviously, politically, it was a fascinating time, given that we were in a minority government led by Prime Minister Gillard, working with the crossbench and the independents. And they were very different as well from each other. And then left Stephen's office when my wife and I were expecting our third child, set up my own consulting firm, and then entered the Victorian Parliament in December, or the election of November 14, took up my position in December 14. Became a minister soon after, did that for 3.5 years, left government soon after the election in 2019, having spent nearly a term as a minister and having decided that I had given pretty much what I could. Became the Executive GM at Australia Post, and then for a variety of reasons decided to move on, which was really important because both my parents were quite ill last year. Not related to COVID, but during and throughout COVID. So I have one sister who lives overseas, which meant that I became the primary caregiver for both of them. Since then, the Morrison government appointed me prior to Christmas to the AAT part-time. So I'm undertaking that work. I'm on a number of corporate boards, number of not-for-profit boards, and I'm also the managing partner of an advisory firm called Horizontas, with a couple of other partners as well, as we build that up, working across climate change, corporate affairs and cross-border commerce.
So Phil, you're a great example because you've moved in and out of corporate and commercial roles, as well as worked as a staffer within a minister's office and been a minister yourself. What has life in politics contributed to your career? Why was it valuable?
Yeah, so it's fascinating because the understanding of how government works versus the private sector has been quite an eye-opener. So people often will ask me what's the difference between the two, and the best way I can surmise it is to say that in the private sector, often the profit motive is your primary objective. How you get there, you should try and obviously do it as ethically and legally as you can, without question. Within the public sector, the outcome is only 49% of the goal. 51% is the process. which is a really interesting learning for mine. You can have the wrong process and the right outcome and lose your job in the public sector. You can have the right process and the wrong outcome and be protected for life. So, neither of those circumstances are as black and white within the private sector. So from my perspective, that's probably been the most fascinating learning that I've had. And then understanding how government works and how slow it is, even when it's moving quickly, and how much patience you need to have in the private sector when you deal with government.
Yeah. And how did you get an opportunity to be a political staffer? Where did that come from?
So I'd always been political from a young age. I joined the Labor Party when I was 15 years old, when I did an assignment on the Labor Party for my politics class at school. That required me to literally catch public transport out to the Labor Party head office and buy a rule book for them, of which was the assignment at the time. And I still remember the woman at the reception desk looking at me as if I was crazy buying a rule book. Nevertheless, that started my career in the Labor Party, and I guess from that moment on, I wanted to, at some point, test myself and see whether the skills that I'd learned over the time through university, my life experience as well, held me in good stead to provide good advice to my minister at the time, and whether or not my political antenna was working as well.
Exactly. Obviously part of it is building those relationships within the party, getting to know people. We talk a lot about political staffers, political office. Who are they? Like, when you're in federal politics, in a cabinet minister's office, who are the political staffers? What are their backgrounds?
Oh, they'll vary. You will get people that are seconded from departments that have expert policy expertise. You will have people that have come up through the ranks and will serve their member of parliament or their minister because they've got a very strong party political background. Yeah. You'll have people that cross over the divide, like myself, that have party political background, but also professional expertise that they bring to the role. So it really is sort of a licorice all sorts, and I think that kind of serves democracy well. You tend to want more people with life experience, I think, than less. And I think some of the problems that we're seeing in Canberra at the moment probably come from having essentially young kids being given a lot of responsibility and a lot of power too quickly without having life experience to be able to, I guess, measure against their activities.
And Phil, is that new? I mean, I guess we're all looking at what's happening in Canberra at the moment and the news around that. But why is that different to when you're in Parliament House, or, is there a change in the type of stuff that's in there?
Well, I can say this, and I'm just going to try and make sure I get this right. So, right, hand on heart, right? I'm no longer a member of Parliament. I'm no longer a politician. So what I say now is 100% the truth always, right? I never, ever experienced anything that's being reported. Never, ever. Now, I was a staffer in state. I was a staffer in federal. The idea that people would behave in such a way is as foreign to me hearing about it and learning about it now as it would have been back then. So, I am as shocked by this as many other people. You hear of stories about what the younger generation get up to, but this is probably important to note. When I worked for Senator Conroy, I was already married. I had 2 children. And as I said, I left when our third was on the way. And so I guess my life was around working and doing the job in Canberra and then going back to bed, because I was often in the office between 6 and 6:30 in the morning. And I was often at the office at least until somewhere between 8:30 and 10:30 most nights. And when I was done, I wasn't looking to go out. I wasn't looking to go to one of the bars in Kingston or Monica. I was going home to get as much sleep as I could, because you never knew what was in store the next day. And you actually sometimes didn't know if you were going to get home the next night or you were going to have to work through. So these young staffers that work hard during the day and play harder at night and then do it all again, that wasn't me. So it could have happened when I was there, and I may have just missed out on it all because I was just a different generation.
All right, good insight. So Phil, maybe take your time as a minister in the Victorian government. Like, can you explain the makeup of your office? How many people did you have? What were their roles, and what skills did you value the most?
Well, it's a fascinating question that you've just asked me. When I put my ministerial office together, my office was built around two people. The very first person was my executive assistant. Her name was Janine Robb, and she was my rock. She was everything to me. She would give me, in her own special way, advice when she said, you need to just relax. You need to maybe take some time off and sort of reposition yourself or regather. At the same time, you've got my chief of staff, who has actually sadly passed away from health complications, but he was a former senator. Mehmet Tillam was his name, and he was, as all great relationships are, they're the exact opposite, the yin and yang, right? So I was outgoing or extroverted. I thin sliced a lot with decision making because I would have sometimes a lot of evidence, sometimes I'd have a little bit, but I had to make decisions quickly. He was the opposite. He was an introvert. He was considered. He took his time. So you need to make sure you've got people in your office, number one, that are loyal and supportive to you. And by loyal, I don't mean will do anything that you ask. Loyal in terms of they will give you the advice that you need when you need to get it, as difficult as that advice may be. So the first thing I look for in a staffer, will they tell me the truth? Will they be honest and open with me, or will they tell me what I want to hear? I could get a dime a dozen people that will tell me what I want to hear. I can't find that many people that will tell me what I need to know when I need to know it. And so from my perspective, that was the most important characteristic: honesty, loyalty, and then, of course, trust. And trust comes from working with people over a period of time as well. And it will be no surprise that my EA I knew from both the Victorian Government and the federal government. She had worked for Prime Minister Gillard and also for Premier Brax as one of his and her EAs. And as I said, Mehmet had been a senator in the Australian Parliament and also had found himself in other roles in other offices. So had immense experience of running an office, as I had, having been a staffer, but it meant that I could then focus on other things, which I knew that they had control of in my office.
And how did you retain your staff? I mean, we hear about the long hours, the hard work, the personal stress involved. What did you learn, I guess, about retaining staff in that environment?
Well, the first thing is you need to treat them well. You need to treat them as if you were them, right? From my perspective, that was a no-brainer. So, I was pretty demanding, so I don't want to pretend that it was all beers and Skittles. I was pretty demanding of my staff, but I was very supportive of what they needed and how they needed it. So I had one staff member that did a master's, and so I gave them time off during parliamentary sitting weeks as well when they needed it. I had another staffer that was a single mum and without betraying confidences, went through a pretty nasty divorce at the time. So I was there supporting her while she went through those personal circumstances, and that meant giving her time off at different periods of the day and the week to deal with her personal circumstances. I employed a young man who had come from a very challenging background through the education system, but had become a teacher, had done an amazing job of turning their life around, and wanted to support them in their personal growth. So and through it all, of course, I had more women working for me than men, because for me it was very important to try and nurture and support both gender equity within my office. And also I lived that when I was a minister as well. I was the first minister, not just in Victoria, but in Australia, to sign the panel pledge, which meant that I wouldn't speak at a conference and I wouldn't use my departmental funds to support a conference unless they had a 50-50 gender equity split in their conferences. So you've got to talk the talk, but more importantly, you've got to be able to walk it. And through that, I felt that my staff responded appropriately and accordingly. So when I made demands on them, it was nothing that I wouldn't do myself.
Mm. And how did diversity kind of benefit your office? Like, what was the value in focusing on diversity versus, probably an easier option, which was, just the right skills for the job?
So it's like life, Vanessa. You can't experience and be the font of all knowledge. Well, most ministers probably think that they are, but I had a pretty good self-assessment, I guess, or self-reflection. The one thing I'll say by way of answering your question, though, and this may hold me up to being a poorer light than to which I would prefer, but as a member of Parliament, I was in my electorate office rarely as a minister, maybe once a fortnight, as I focused on my ministerial duties, not at the expense of my electorate office, but it wasn't until probably about the third year of my term that I had a female office manager. And when she came and spoke to me and she said, look, we need a sanitary bin in the bathroom. And I'm like, oh, okay. What had happened was I had female employees, but when I say younger women, probably teenagers in their 20s at university, part-time. And it was not something that I had experience with or been conscious of. And much to my embarrassment, I had overlooked the need to provide those facilities. And it wasn't until my female office manager, who was around my age, had brought it to my attention that we then rectified that and obviously got one in straight away. That kind of gives you an understanding, as an analogy, that if you sometimes don't have those experiences, you don't understand what other people's experience and reflections are. And so in my office, I needed to make sure that I had people that had a range of experiences that I did not, that would be able to give me advice and also a reference check for what we were doing and how we were doing it.
Mm. We've got questions coming in from our audience. Thank you, Lisa and Kim. I'll start with Kim's question. Have you got a view about how external comms and corporate affairs should engage with government or ministerial staff on hot topics? So I guess the question is the insider's view. How do we get to you as a minister, and what's your advice on that?
Yeah, so that's a tough question, because it really does depend upon the issue, the urgency of the issue, not to your client, but maybe the public policy response. So the first thing is always to try and communicate with the ministerial office, right? I know it sounds simple, but it can be challenging, and I appreciate that. If you can make them alert to something that is going to happen, that they need to be aware of, that will blow up and become an issue for them to have to deal with, if you've spoken to them and brought it to their attention, then quite frankly, they can have no qualms about what then subsequently happens if they didn't deal with it. At the same time, the last thing you want to do is have your client go out and make commentary about a minister and something that they've done if you haven't had the opportunity to talk to them about it. I'll give you an example. When I was the Minister for Small Business, I had responsibility for public holidays, which meant that I had to implement the Grand Final Friday public holiday here in Victoria. I had one business industry leader go out, who I had known for 15 years, go out and publicly attack me personally for this policy in the media. I rang them up and I said, "What are you doing?" I said, "You haven't even spoken to me about this." "Oh, you're right." And they apologised and we got our relationship back on track. But because I knew them, I was happy to ring them up myself. Ministers may not do that if they don't know the people or the clients responsible. So A, you need to build that relationship, and B, you need to be open with them. If it's, for example, a tender, it's a different story, right? Because there's probity issues around tenders. So it will be a horses for courses approach, and it will depend on the significance, the public importance of the policy, and of course, the dollar value at the end of the day to the client.
And what are your tips on building a relationship? I mean, that's obvious. I guess, but like practically, how do you do it? Like, well, you know, is it via your staff? Is it, you know, through a phone call? Is it, you know, how do you go about it when you've got so much on your agenda as a minister? What might be important to us may not be important to you. Like, what is the practical advice on building that long-term relationship?
So it will depend on minister to minister. I mean, I was very, very proactive with communication and tried to respond as much as I could to social media, whether it was through LinkedIn or Twitter or whether it was Instagram, social, Facebook, etc. So I always tried to, if I got an inquiry, either deal with it myself or pass it on to my office to deal with. I always had a view, both from a staffer, but also when I ran my ministerial office, that anybody that had a phone call or an inquiry into our office had the respect to have their inquiry returned. Now, that may not have been with me, but it would have been with either one of my staff or somebody in the department that reported back to my private office as to where the matter was. So sometimes it's just picking up a call and making a call to find out if you can speak to the advisor that's got responsibility for the policy. If you don't know them, it is simple as a cold call. Otherwise, if you know people that know people, do use them, right? Having the ability for somebody to vouch for you goes a long way in politics, because the last thing that a staffer wants to do is have a conversation with you that is going to find its way onto the front page of a newspaper. They want to have some trust that if they're going to be responsive to your needs, that you're also going to be professional about the way that you hold that relationship.
Great. Now, Lisa had a question going back to the earlier conversation we had around the situation of the day. I don't know if you've got an answer for this, but, you know, why do you think the Morrison government's employed junior staffers in Canberra that lack life and career experience?
Okay, so let me just say from the outset, that is not a Morrison government trait only, right? You will find young staffers of all political colours and persuasions, whether it be Labor, Liberal, National, Green or crossbench, working in all offices across the country, whether it be state government or federal government. I think what we're seeing here is a level of behaviour and depravity that I don't think can be ascribed to a political belief system. Honestly, I'm not trying to protect the Morrison government. I'm not trying to propel the Labor opposition. Truly, I just think it's a commentary on these individuals. How they got through the system, that's probably a more important question. How did they not get vetted appropriately? And when their behaviour came to light, who was it that didn't act upon it? And I note that Peter Credlin made commentary last night that she repeated today, that the staffer in question that was terminated, she had terminated herself and they had been re-employed once Prime Minister Abbott had left his role. So I think those questions of process become far more important to try and find out what happened when, where and how, and why wasn't those people held to account, and where was that information retained, and why wasn't it passed up the line to be dealt with? And if it was, why wasn't it dealt with?
So you've got experience.
So Vanessa, can I just point out, right?
Yeah.
By no means am I suggesting that somebody that's young, that doesn't necessarily have the same life experience as what I did, doesn't have a role to play in a political system. I've met some very young people that are ridiculously gifted in their policy and political expertise that deserve an opportunity to contribute in their roles. So this is not something that says if you are below a certain age, you should not apply, full stop. You know, you see that in the AFL for me in Victoria, or whether it's rugby league or rugby union, rugby league or rugby union in the northern states in particular. If you've got a youngster that's got expertise and shows a proficiency, let them play. Same thing in politics. But my point is that you need to have a variety of all ages. And again, without being ridiculous in a sporting context, if you have a team full of 18-year-olds, they're going to get smashed every day of the week. If you have a team full of 34-year-olds, they're going to lose as well. So you need to find that balance, and a political office is no different. Great
answer. Okay, a couple more questions here. from Jackson Stiles, Policy Advisor at the Governance Institute of Australia. Do you have any reflections on the precarious employment conditions and high pressure on political staffers? Does this need to change to attract a higher quality of candidates from the private sector, for example?
I'm not sure that it will change. The level, I guess, of expectation when you work in an office is immense. And when you're working for a federal minister, no different from a state, but when you're working for a federal minister, the level of responsibility is huge. And so you feel, I mean, if you have a sense of your own professional performance, you have an expectation on yourself to perform, but you also have the weight of that performance. Whether you'll get people from the private sector contributing, there is a distinct issue about remuneration. I know that people don't like talking about this and they complain about the amount that people are paid, but I earn far more in the private sector than I ever earned in the public sector. So why would you have somebody that has to face media scrutiny? This becomes more of an issue really in public life, in parliamentary office, than as a staffer. But why would you have somebody that holds them up to that kind of scrutiny? And as we go past day by day, the scrutiny on staffers is far greater than it was 10 years ago and before that. So you might have a staffer, for example, that in their private life does everything legal but enjoys in swinging activities or partakes in illicit but what some people would regard as recreational drugs, etc. That becomes a media story if you work for a Minister of the Crown, state or federal. And so, you know, you need to be aware of those responsibilities because it doesn't matter what you do or how you do it. What matters is the impact it has on the government, your agenda, and then the narrative that is now being able to be weaved around, for example, with the Morrison government as a result of individuals' actions.
Excellent. We do have time for another couple of questions if anyone has any. Probably, you know, what I'd love from you, Phil, is like, yeah, what's your advice to our audience in terms of politics or political staffer for a career? Like, what are the top 3 tips you would have as an option?
So the first one will be, what are your expectations? They need to be managed. It's not the West Wing. Let me assure you, for those of you that love the West Wing, it is not the West Wing. It is more utopia than anything else, right? And so you need to be prepared to go into it with your eyes wide open. You have to have, from my perspective, a love of public policy. That's why I was involved from the beginning. I had a deep love of public policy. Politics for me was a means to an end, and that ends was public policy and getting the best public policy you can. Next one, you have to be pragmatic, right? The idea of public policy purity is just a fiction, right? It doesn't happen because of the way that parliaments are structured, because of the democracy that we are represented by. You always have trade-offs. So, for example, in Victoria, as like the federal parliament, our upper house or Senate is a mixture of crossbenchers and minor parties. That means that you need to horse trade to get legislation through. That will always then require you to alter your legislation according to how you can get the votes to get it through. That's life. If you can't deal with that, don't enter politics, don't enter public policy debate or advisory roles itself.
Thank you so much, Phil. We're so lucky to have you to share all of those perspectives. We really appreciate it. For everyone that joined us today, we will be wrapping up the conversation and sharing that on Commtract Social Assets if you'd like more. Phil, thank you very much.
Pleasure, Vanessa. And the one thing I'll say is that if any of the network that are watching this or otherwise want to get in contact with me, please feel free to do so via Vanessa or LinkedIn. Mention that you watch this. If you've got any additional questions that you didn't want Vanessa to see, but would like me to answer, please reach out to me and I'll be happy to do that.
Thanks very much. That's wonderful, Phil. And I'd encourage you, Phil's got a lot to share. So please take that up if you'd like to.
One last thing, Vanessa. Vanessa worked with me when I was in Senator Conroy's office. So maybe she can interview herself and tell you what it was like working with me from a stakeholder perspective into a ministerial office.
That's right. Well, I think the fact that we're here today, nearly 10 years later, is a testament to, you know, building great relationships, which you're awesome at. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Ness.
All right. See you, everyone. Thanks so much.
Yeah.